Executive Director for the National Federation of Independent Businesses, Jim Schultz, President of the Minnesota Private Business Council, and John Phelan, Economist at Center for Numerical Experiment. We're going to spend, I think, about 45 minutes or so talking about this year's legislative session, and then we're going to try to leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions. And what we've done is to divide the conversation into 4 different segments. Start by talking about things the legislature revisited from last year's session. Next, things the legislature has actually done so far, kind of a surprisingly short list. Third, things we think they're going to do yet this year before the session ends. And finally, bad ideas that were floated this year that we don't think are going to pass this year, but that are probably not dead. So, with that prelude, let's just jump right in with things that the legislature revisited from last year's session. As you know, they passed a blizzard of bad legislation in 2023, and after the fact, they acknowledged that there were some things that needed some fixes. So let's start with paid family leave. John Reynolds, what is the story of paid family leave?
Well, first, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with all of you. On paid family leave, I think most of you will remember from last year, this is the single largest mandate on private employers in the state's history, and probably the single largest tax increase ever in the state's history. So, $1.5 billion a year payroll tax. And the fundamental problem with the program, John, is that it doesn't work. And it's not going to work, and it's probably not going to get better. They have to build out a brand new IT system, which you know our state is not great at. Think of Insure, Inlars, Health Match. We've had a long record of failure in that area. All of the same elements aren't set up to happen with paid family medical leave. So this year they're back to try to stand off some of the rough edges from last year. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on perspective, I mean, unfortunately, certainly for the people who have to live with it, they're not addressing the biggest problems, which is that they're giving people up to 20 weeks. Every worker, every person gets 20 weeks off per year for basically any reason. Your own medical issue, to take care of for the birth of a child, or to take care of really anybody you want. So if you have someone with whom there's an expectation to provide care, you can use the paid family medical leave program for that. They're not addressing those big workforce challenges. They're not addressing the costs of the program, which is going to skyrocket and take more and more out of your business, out of your paycheck. It's just a mess, and I don't see how it works. We're supposed to, this program is supposed to start on January 1, 2026, and just really not sure. I don't see how it works.
Is there anything that they actually fixed this year?
A few rough edges, like so employer notification. This was a big issue for us. You know, of course they can't actually bring themselves. The DFL can't bring themselves to actually require employees to do anything. They get things. They don't have to do anything. That's how laws work right now, and for the past year and a half. You get stuff for free, or you get stuff that other people pay for, but you don't do anything for it. And a big issue for us was, well, what do you mean? An employee can just leave and not tell the employer. There's no obligation to tell their employer that they're going on leave for 6, 12, 20 weeks. That's crazy. And they didn't think that was crazy. They passed a law that doesn't require the employee to actually tell the employer they're leaving. So one of the things we are working on fixing, and hopefully will get fixed this year, is that employer notification piece, as well as a notice if you're an employer or an employee or anybody who gets a paycheck, that the FML tax rate is going to change from one year to the next. And what's happened in other states that pass these programs are, for instance, Washington State launched theirs in 2020, and in 4 years the payroll tax is doubled. Some similar things will happen here, maybe not quite that dramatically, but we're at least going to make sure you know how much you're going to pay, and you know what your employees can use the program.
John Phelan, they did something with the income tax standard deduction. What's that?
Yeah, well, what happened in the 2023 tax bill they inadvertently undid the inflation indexing, which goes back to 2019, so they changed that now, and that was a reasonably kind of quick fix. So there's not a great deal to say about it. What I would say, and this goes back to what John was just saying, is that the amount of legislation that was passed last year was huge. And they were passing so much, so quickly, that they messed up a lot of the time. So the standard deduction thing, this was one. And then you've got the PFML, I mean, that's just full of ridiculous things. That sailed through committee after committee before it got a fiscal vote. So there was no idea how much this was going to cost. And I think it was the Finance Committee actually sent it through without a fiscal vote. So the Finance Committee was supposed to sit there and say, well, this is going to cost X and we can afford it. They had no idea. They voted it through anyway. You've got to pass it to find out what's in it. Haven't we got used to that? And so I think, that it's symbolic of a kind of larger problem, which is that they're very slapdash, lackadaisical, careless, call it what you want. And they will just ram things through because they saw a narrow window of opportunity, and they took it.
Jim Schultz, one of the things that got a lot of publicity after the last session was the issue of school resource officers, and that was one that they vowed that they were going to go back and fix. What's the story?
Yes, so if everybody remembers, in 2023, the folks running our government slipped into the education bill a prohibition on school resource officers using certain types of restraints against students. It was bizarre they did so. There had never been any instance of a police officer inappropriately using force on students and so forth. They did it in a pretty grand fashion and snuck it into the bill. Once it came out, and obviously there was mass, substantial opposition to this. Obviously, we need our police officers in our schools to be able to use the force necessary to protect students. There's some pretty big kids in high school. I was not one of them, but there are, big football players and otherwise that may be armed and so forth. And police officers need to be able to use the force necessary to protect the kids. And so after one of those instances where Governor Walz last fall had approach being courageous and then pulled back, and it decided not to get it fixed immediately, so we did not have school resource officers in these schools for quite a while. They did fix it earlier in the session, or substantially fix it to allow these types of restraints. But it was one of those times where you see in our state, where the progressives, those on the left, couch a lot of what they're doing in very rosy terms, fairness, justice, all this sort of stuff. But periodically the mask slips, and that's not a reference to Senator Nicole Mitchell. That periodically the mask slips, and they do things that are extraordinarily hard left, extraordinarily indicative of their outlook. And their outlook is that broadly, they don't really need police. They don't really believe in law enforcement. They view police and look down on police. They tend to view them as being often a malignant presence in our cities and our communities otherwise. And so you get legislation like that. But they did fix it after immense public opposition.
So I would just like to walk with one thing that they didn't, and that was the COVID payments that people received, which were taxed. In every other state that got these things, they weren't taxed because they were deemed to be kind of emergency payments. Only Minnesota were they taxed, because even though the federal government announced in February, COVID-19 emergency ends in May, Minnesota state government didn't pass the bill needed to make these things tax exempt, because they were too busy passing all these other things, like driver's license for illegal immigrants, free college for illegal immigrants, making the state a trans refuge state, the abort bill that went through. These are the things that really mattered. So everyone got clobbered with this extra tax liability on April the 15th because the DFL didn't really care about it. And I think it's kind of crazy, the DFL whined and moaned about this. They finally found a tax they didn't like. And people ended up with a liability that they shouldn't have had.
All right, let's move on to the second category. That is things the legislature has actually done so far. And as you'll see, it's a pretty short list. After the blizzard of 2023, they didn't really leave too much on the table. for 2024. But let's start with the budget. John Phelan, we do have some spending increase, right? Talk about that.
Yeah, there's not a great deal to say about this, really. We had this absolutely massive budget increase last year. Government spending is going to grow by something like 33% over a couple of bienniums. It's just absolutely kind of crazy. But even so, it must be said that revenues are holding up. Tax revenues are coming in above forecast, and there's kind of other reasons for that. The same thing is happening in other states, but not in every other state, but in a good number of other states. So it's not necessarily anything wonderful that's being done here. But we do have kind of, the revenue forecasts are being kind of revised upwards, except for a little bit further out, they're being revised downwards. But we increased spending by about, I think it's something like $500 billion or something over the next few years. So it's not huge in the context. It's kind of crazy that we're talking about an increase in spending like that, and we're saying, well, it's not big. It's not big relative to what we just had, which just kind of rebases everything, really.
But they have $500 million on top of it, which, seems to me to be kind of a news story.
It is, but like I said, as an increment, it's not huge. I think it's big because, because of what's gone before, because of what we've had. But I think they are, I think looking towards November, they're trying to be on their best behaviour a wee bit. Let's see what happens, down the line.
What's stunning is that we entered 2023 with a nearly $20 billion surplus. As John said, revenues are still on the rise, but we have $1.5 billion deficit in the next budget. I mean, how is that possible? It's the most irresponsible thing possibly we've ever seen in the state's history.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. So we had some election legislation so far this year, Jim, and I assume that was to tighten up our elections, improve ballot security. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. We'd like to see things like, maybe, voter ID, things like that. But unfortunately, we didn't get that. We got some things like, the schools are now required to hand out voter registration information to get folks registered so they can automatically vote when they're 18. They also changed a couple other things. They made it so that somebody doesn't actually have to give an address. They want to make sure that homeless are able to vote, so you can just indicate exactly, roughly kind of where you live, and that's sufficient for voter registration.
And Jeff, let's just pause there for a second, because I understand it. Like, the guy can show you a map, and the homeless person can say, I'm somewhere around here.
Yes.
And that's good enough. Now, state law requires, if you've got somebody that shows up saying they registers, that the county is going to send a postcard to him to confirm his existence. That's under state law. Hard to do in this case.
Well, that's for example, and impossible to do in that case, and it just goes to show there's people not only should our elections be secure, but people should perceive them as secure. Those should be the twin goals of our election policy. And we do so many things like this, like not requiring voter ID, things along those lines that are not conducive to people trusting our election system, and so they're continuing to put out that after.
John Phelan, the last thing in this category is something that we couldn't put in the last category. A whole bad ideas to watch out for in the future. But the legislature commissioned a feasibility study for a vast expansion of our state tax system. Can you describe that?
Yeah, this is a thing called worldwide combined reporting. It might be the kind of dullest thing that you'll hear about tonight, but in some ways it's one of the biggest I think that you'll hear about. This room is probably full of people who know more about this than I do. But essentially, what combined reporting is, which is mandated by Minnesota law, is that corporate entity and its kind of sub-component parts and its subsidiaries have to file a kind of unified tax statement in Minnesota regardless of the entity or organization. The thing is, that obligation stops at the water's edge. It doesn't apply outside the United States. It's only kind of to the United States entities. What worldwide combined reporting would do, it would extend that to all income earned by a corporate parent or a subsidiary anywhere in the world. So it's a huge thing really to kind of to impose. No other state in America imposes this. No other country in the world imposes this. There is absolutely no problem that you can point to and say this solves it. I think we may talk about something a little bit later on, mandatory disclosure, which this is kind of very closely related to. They all come from the same place, which is essentially a distrust and a loathing of business on the part of, I think, the EFL, and just really a desire to kind of load it with more and more obligations. But the ramifications of this are worldwide, literally. I've worked as a consultant in London, and I've worked with businesses kind of around Europe. And this will affect all of those. When this came up last session, I actually got in touch with people back home and said, you want to watch out for this. And I remember my old boss emailed me back and said, crikey, I thought all the tax lunatics that finance like the Atlantic. And I said, sadly not, no. So yeah, this is huge. And what's happened is they haven't passed it this year because it's very, very difficult to make work. It is kind of technical. But they do want to move on with it. So what they are going to do is commission a feasibility study of this and then get some kind of revenue estimate. Because no one knows what this is going to generate. It shouldn't actually generate any new revenue, which is just kind of crazy that it imposes extra cost for that. But this is the point that I would make. We'll probably come back to it. This is an idea that came up last year and got dropped. It's coming back this year as a feasibility study, and it will come back again. If it doesn't pass this year, if it doesn't pass next year, it will come back again. All these bad ideas that you hear about that come up and they go away, they will come back again.
All right, let's move on to the next category. That is things that we believe that the legislature probably will still do this year, either in omnibus bills at the end of the session or otherwise. And of course, this conversation is framed by the Nicole Mitchell episode and something that we couldn't have foreseen. But one obvious question is, well, wait a minute, the Democrats have got this skinny 34-33 Senate majority. What happens when one of the 34 gets charged with a felony? And it looks like we got the answer to that question because they held a vote on whether Nicole Mitchell would be permitted to vote for the remainder of the session. And Nicole Mitchell cast the deciding 34th vote in favor of herself being able to vote for the remainder of the session. And I think there's a lesson there. We are talking about raw power. We're not talking about anybody trying to do the right thing, the honorable thing, the moral thing. We are talking about raw exercise of power. That is the legislative world that we live in. Well, this is supposedly a bonding year, right? We've almost lost that distinction. But John Reynolds, what's the story there?
First, I do want to say I'm a constituent of Senator Mitchell's out in Woodbury. And after that incident last week, I did see a few more ring cameras on our block. It is a bonding year for those who follow the legislature. Traditionally, bonding years have been even number of years, budget years. The odd year bonding is the even number of year. Increasingly over the last decade and a half, every year has become a bonding year, a bigger and bigger bonding year. So bonding bills, capital investment projects, it should be things like funding local government infrastructure, roads, bridges, water, sewer, police stations, fire departments, city halls, rec centers, that sort of thing. Occasionally, usually about every 2 years, you see $20 or $30 million slipped in there for another renovation of Nicollet Mall in downtown Minneapolis. There have been really weird iterations. I think Roz remembers, campfire pits on Nicollet Mall, and fig trees, and big palm trees, and all kinds of crazy ideas we've seen over the years. There are some core elements that I think a lot of people would disagree with in bonding bills in terms of real basic infrastructure, and then there are the piggish items. Last year was really piggy. They passed a $2.6 billion bonding bill, which was the largest in state history by a lot, says Senator Kazalka. At least $1 billion, more than $1 billion over the last biggest bonding bill. It was a monstrosity, and most people thought, hey, well, maybe we're done and we won't have a bonding bill this year. But they're back with one, of course, at another $1 billion they released on Monday in the Minnesota House. It's about 600 of it is, mostly that core infrastructure that people would argue about, except for the total number. And then my favorite is they parked $300 million in something called the library fund, which is just a set aside for how the amount of money that they're going to divide up among local earmarks, essentially, of lawmakers. So bonding, you know, we can argue the merits of it all day long, or how much, or what it goes towards, but really what it is just a vehicle for the minority in each body to negotiate. It's the one point of leverage they have, because you need 60% of the body in each chamber, and as John mentioned, very narrow majorities right now in both the House and Senate, which gives the minority Republicans leverage, theoretically, to negotiate if they're capable of executing that leverage.
Well, what are they negotiating? Are they trying to get the spending down, or just trying to get their piece of the pie?
Well, my ask is to get out of there now. Negotiate it. We're done. A bonding bill and adjourn. Nothing else. That's my ask. I realize it's a little pie in the sky. I have other asks, like killing paid family medical leave or pushing it out a year or two. We'll see what they get. Last year, to my disappointment, they negotiated $300 million in extra funding for nursing homes, which was really important, but not so important that it merited a $2.6 billion bonding bill. So there's a range of things on the table. Yet to really grasp what the Republicans want solidly.
So the bonding bill is supposed to cover state stuff, isn't it? I mean, but nowadays there's all kinds of local spending that goes into the bonding bill, isn't that right? It's been a fertile source, I think, of golden turkey nominees in recent years. Do we know what all these projects are at this point or not?
We know what they are, except for that $300 million mystery bucket in the library fund. And I don't think that that's going to be going to buy books or libraries for little kids or anything.
That's where the golden turkeys are hiding. When it's too late, so when we spend it so we know what was in the bill, we'll not have to look at that for next year's nominees. They also had some movement on the minimum wage and the minimum wage for disabled people. John, what's that about?
There's a couple of things here. The one thing that I've written about kind of most is at the moment there's an exemption for minimum wage rates for people with disabilities, and it's kind of sensible because you're paid to your productivity, as the economic textbooks will tell you, and different people produce different values, and so they will be paid differently. This is not a comment on the morality or the humanity of people. It's just a comment on their economic output and the value of their economic output in the marketplace. And so by acknowledging that people have different productivity levels, then what these exemptions do is say, well, okay, we will adjust for that. So the other one of these as well is abolishing the certain minimum wage for workers under 18. That's another good example. So what happens with a minimum wage rate is you don't automatically magic anybody's wages up. All you do is you make it illegal to hire somebody whose economic productivity is below a certain rate. Now, if you think that productivity is a function of certain things like experience, that does mean that younger workers will generally be less productive than older workers. So you're going to go back to this reason why we have these differential minimum wage rates. And so getting rid of these differential rates, it kind of ignores economic reality. And what you get is this kind of moralistic argument that, you're saying some people are worth less than others. No, you're not. What you're saying is that some people's economic output is worth less than others. My economic output is worth less than, Kirk Cousins' economic output. Well, a bad example perhaps. But, so you have this situation, you can't wish these things away, you can't ignore these things, which is exactly really what these bills do. And I think where they've done this, go back to the disability point, in other states where they've done this, what you see is disabled job losses. Now, if you look at Minnesota, it actually has one of the highest rates of disabled employment in the United States. So I actually look at the employment policy for disabled workers in this state and think it's a bit of a success. I don't think we should be trying to kneecap it with this new law. I think it's kind of a really mean-spirited policy. It will be mean in its effects.
And just to put kind of a personal spin on that, right, to John's point about pegging to value, but Anne, who's about 60 years old, who lives in a group home, she's mentally disabled, born that way, love her dearly. She has a job as a cook at a college, she lives in a different state. If there wasn't this other new she wouldn't have a job. And it's not the pay, it's the social value that she derives from having a job, the sense of self-worth, and the socialization that she gets outside of the narrow set of people that she lives with. So, I wholeheartedly agree with John. I think it's, the moralizers are the immoral ones here.
Yeah, there's all sorts of research that shows that employment is linked to positive mental health outcomes. Isolation is bad for people. That's one of the lessons of the last few years, certainly. Now you want to kind of isolate some people on a permanent basis by legislation. I think it's awful. It really is bad.
So another one that we think is going to pass between now and the end of the session is $100 million being allocated for what's called basic income. What's that?
Well, you notice they don't call it universal basic income, and that's because it's not universal. And it's not even really a basic income, in fact. It's just another welfare payment. The way that universal basic income works is that you pick some amount, let's call it $10,000 a year, and you say that every person in the state or the country gets this amount. No questions asked. Here it is. Here's your 10 grand cash. Whether you're, CEO of a Fortune 500 company, or whether you're, somebody earning absolutely nothing, living somewhere else, And so that's a UBI. And there's actually, some conservative support for policies like that. So if you said to me, we are going to abolish the entire welfare system and replace it with a UBI, okay, that might actually be better. You cut out a lot of overhead. The thing is, I think the politics are completely impossible. I don't think you're ever going to see, the welfare system abolished and replaced with the UBI. So I think it's pie in the sky. What you'll get is something that runs in tandem with the existing welfare system. Also things like Milton Friedman's old negative income tax. In effect, that was essentially like a UBI. But what you notice there is that these things are universal. This proposal is not universal. This is the first issue with it. So it only goes to certain people who meet certain criteria. That's the first issue with it. It's not a universal basic income. It's not a basic income. The second point, and this is perhaps the even worse point, is that the state government wants to fund the administration of this policy out to a whole bunch of non-profits. And they can impose their own...
Not us, by the way.
Sorry, not us. Whenever the state government is dishing out money to non-profits, we're never in a queue. Funny that. But it's an interesting point, So what they do is they outsource the management of this entire scheme to non-profits and NGOs or whatever, Mangos, they call them back home. And so they can impose their own criteria. So they could say that, you only get this if you're a certain race, you only get this money if you're a certain, sports affiliation. Whatever, pick you want. So it's kind of bad. I mean, it's just going to be essentially a big slush fund that's going to be directed towards sensitive voter demographics. That's all it will be.
Have non-profits ever mismanaged public money?
I'll get back to you on that.
All right, so for those of you who think that we don't have enough legislature here in Minnesota, we may be getting more. Jim Schultz.
Yes, so one proposal, one of the worst ideas going through the legislature right now is to get a full-time legislature in the state. Under the state constitution right now, the number of days of the convening session is limited, and the period during which the convening session is limited. Democrats want to do away with that, alongside some other more popular things like limiting lobbying by legislators after they're elected and things like that. So there's two issues with it. One, this should be a freestanding thing that voters can say yay or nay to when it's on the ballot. Instead, there's a few other policies as part of it. But number two, we should have a full-time legislature. Last year, we had, over a few months, we had some of the most destructive legislation in our state's history in a few months. And just think what they could do if they had 12 months to wreak havoc on the state of Minnesota. So it's a terrible idea. Hopefully it won't make it to the ballot. If it does, folks like those in this room need to organize to try and do it.
Another thing that is bubbling under the surface here that is likely to get passed, I think, you tell me, between now and the end of the session, is some kind of healthcare public option. John, what's the story?
Yeah, public option is just sort of single payer light or the road to single payer. And it used to be such a controversial concept that had stripped out of Obamacare in 2010. Joe Lieberman wouldn't vote for it, and other moderate Democrats wouldn't vote for it, but those aren't Minnesota Democrats for sure. So to Jen's point earlier about studying worldwide combined reporting, starts out as a proposal, turns into a study, comes back as a real tax. That's basically the path we've been on, the public option for 10 to 15 years, both as a country and definitely in Minnesota. This has been studied to death. It's very expensive. Essentially, it's a government-controlled health insurance product. If you think of combining the friendly customer service of a large insurance company with the efficiency of a government agency.
Is this a camel's nose under the tent? I mean, the public option is step one to socialize medicine. Is that the plan?
Absolutely, and we're in a really precarious spot in Minnesota, more so than other places that have tried this, because we have what's called a reinsurance program, where the state essentially subsidizes a portion of very high-cost medical claims in the individual market. Those people who buy insurance on their own, don't get it from the government or through work, who happen to be a lot of NFIB members, a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of small business owners, and their employees. That reinsurance subsidy, which keeps rates down and keeps people in the market, which, by the way, has existed in some form in a bipartisan fashion since the 1970s here, goes away after 2025. And the Democrats are proposing to replace that with a public option, which is a government-directed health insurance plan, with a very high, if you think of a platinum plan, a Cadillac plan, and they say, well, this is great. You don't have to worry about out-of-pocket costs, deductibles, anything like that. And you stop and think, well, how is that possible? How can I have 95% of my medical costs covered under this plan and still have it be an affordable premium? Well, how else? They're going to raise taxes to subsidize it, and then they're going to cut reimbursement rates to providers, shifting all of that cost onto people in this room and everywhere else who get their coverage through their employer. So it's such a bad idea, even private labor unions oppose it. But that said, it's probably likely to pass.
All right, let's move on to the final category that we have planned to talk about here today. Then we'll open it up to some questions. And that's something that I think, John, you kind of hinted at earlier, but bad ideas don't die. You think of socialism, right? I mean, what is that idea? Finally going to die? Maybe never. And so there are some proposals that have kicked around that probably are not even going to come up for a vote this year. Just they got the toe in the water, and it's the over to the window. We're starting to talk about them, get people used to hearing about them, but they're not going away. They're probably going to come back. One of those proposals, Jim Schultz, is the sanctuary state.
Yes, so a lot of folks in here will be familiar with this. This is the idea embraced by a lot of states, or a number of states, New York, Illinois, and Massachusetts, to make themselves a sanctuary state, which means that they don't cooperate with federal immigration authorities in the pursuit and apprehension of illegal immigrants. This is a terrible policy for many, many reasons. I wrote an op-ed, Surprising News Strip, published it a few weeks ago about this. It's one of the most shared and read articles this year. People are fired up about this, not just Republicans but independents, Democrats. People have seen the natural catastrophe that has been our southern border over the past few years. Over the course of the end of Joe Biden's presidency, that God willing will end in 2024, the number of illegal immigrants that enter this country is twice the size of the population of the state of Minnesota. It is outrageous. And the origin of it was when Democrats were running for president, they communicated to the world that They would not deport people if they came here, and then if they came here, folks would have substantial health benefits even if they were illegal immigrants. And so tons and tons of people heard that message and have come to our border now. We're facing this crisis. The states that have embraced sanctuary cities, whether it be New York or otherwise, have incurred massive public costs and billions of dollars. It's bad for our states. It's bad for migrants and immigrants themselves. There's thousands of people who have made the trek through Central America, Mexico, and so forth, that have died on the way to come to our state. There's nothing, when people start talking about these in the terms of fairness or having a heart and things like that, we should remind them that there's nothing just about a policy that encourages illegal immigration, whether for our citizens or for the people who are involved. And so this is one of those terrible ideas. It's going to come back. We already pay here in the state, and I was alluded to earlier, for college tuition for illegal immigrants, health insurance for illegal immigrants. We already made ourselves a magnet, and this is one more step to that. We'll die this year almost certainly, but they certainly want to bring it up in the future.
So our polling shows that it's a very unpopular idea, not just with conservatives, but with Minnesotans generally. But part of what's going on here, I think, Jim, is that the DFLers are looking forward to November. They know some of these things are unpopular. They know they've got a skinny majority in the House of Representatives. Those seats are all up in November. And so I think some of these things they're holding in reserve. They floated the ideas, maybe not bringing them up for a vote, but if they hold the House, we are going to see some of these proposals back next year. This time, probably in more serious form. One of the things, another thing in that category, John Phelan, is the $20 minimum wage. What does that say?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, a lot of it is, as I said earlier, it's absolutely nuts. There are so many workers that will kind of cut off. And you have to think, that what might seem like an acceptable wage, minimum wage, in the Twin Cities, you think of somewhere like Detroit Lakes, much in the news recently, but you think of somewhere like that, the minimum wage, that minimum wage is just it's going to have such a disastrous effect if you force people up there to pay it. I did a report a few years ago where I looked at employment ratios in Minnesota and the US, and I broke them down by various demographics, age, sex and race and all the rest of it. And I found that when you hear that we've got this huge labour force problem and people say, it's old people retiring, it's one of those things that's not entirely true. The steepest decline, if you look at all these employment ratios, was workers aged 16 to 19. It was down something like 20 percentage points from 2000 to like 2018 when I said the data. And it was that fall was the patterns mirrored the national pattern, but it was steeper. That fall was steeper in Minnesota than it was nationally. Now, granted, it fell from a kind of higher level, but you still got to explain that kind of big fall in youth employment. And I think part of the reason is our minimum wages. And it's interesting, I think, to note as well. When you look at that decline in youth employment, I got told by somebody in the state government, they're all in college now. So it's kind of alright, don't worry about the fact they're not in jobs. If they're all off in college only to become nuclear physicists, the next Oppenheimer or somebody, you might think, well, okay, or they're going to build a bridge or something like that. But I'm not sure that's the case. I look at a lot of colleges now and I think, we're probably declining marginal returns here. And so I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. Another aspect to note as well is that there are costs to this. There's research that shows that if you defer your entry into the labour force, you also defer your accumulation of what's called soft skills. Now, what are soft skills? They're the skills that I learned when I was 16 to 18 working in a Pizza Hut, which is, being courteous on the phone, learning new software systems, and frankly dealing with people that I wouldn't necessarily choose to spend time with. These are all things that you think, so what? But these are valuable economic skills. And if you postpone their accumulation, you actually do see, and research is very clear on this, you do see that people earn low wages over their lifetimes. So if we pass this wacky $20 minimum wage bill, we're going to impact youth employment even more severely than we have done in recent years. And that's going to negatively impact Minnesotans' youth right through their working lives.
What are you trying to say about my Palestinian gender studies degree?
Absolutely nothing, I'm sure. It's going to be a wonderful job tonight, sir.
Chuck Reynolds, in my notes here, I've got something about the ABC test, and I have no idea what that is.
Well, it's not about half of the kids in the state not being able to read at grade level. I don't know if it's worse or better, but it's not good news. Some of you may be familiar with California's AB5, or ABC test for independent contractors. Basically, Democrats and some unions in California want to do away with independent contracting. And so they passed a law that essentially said workers will be judged whether they're employees or independent contractors based on a 3-factor test. Are you established as a separate entity? Do you control the means of the work? And then, are you engaged in a trade or occupation field that's similar to the entity that is contracting with you? And that's the key factor, right? Because think about if you're, say, a flooring company, you contract out with other flooring companies, other floors. You do it on an independent contractor basis now. You have members that do that. You have members that do that in all kinds of fields and occupations and industries. You wouldn't be allowed to do that if that became law here. And like all good laws, there's about 114 exceptions now to California's ABC test, mostly for their favored constituency because it had a devastating impact on, of all things, the arts. And so theater workers, orchestras, concerts, they all rely on independent contractors. And it just wouldn't work under this law, so they passed a slew of exceptions, and you better believe they'll be coming for that here next year.
So this is part of this overall effort on the left to force everybody to be an employee.
Yeah.
They don't like people working independently.
They have this just obsession, and this goes to the ABC test, it goes to the family medical leave, to the earned sick time edit, just this obsession with 1950s style employment arrangements, which is so odd for the Party of Progress in the future, that they just want to turn back the clock to, the days when everyone, I grew up in a town where everyone would thrive again, you had a pension, and, it's just nonsense. It's just not modern in any way.
I mean, I think the long-term aim is to, you force all these independent, self-employed people into jobs like this, where they're more easy to unionize and then filch for money and dues. And I think really that's what we're having a lot of.
Speaking of unions, Jim Schultz, striking. And if you're right, this is a proposal that's kicked around, not brought for a vote, but not forgotten, likely to come back. Striking is going to get more comfy than ever.
Yes, so proposed legislation that likely will not happen this year, but has the prospect of happening in the future. The idea is to make unemployment benefits available to striking workers. And the argument for it is that the argument is this, that there's an imbalance of power. If a striking worker doesn't have any income and the employer seems pretty during the strike. Well, of course, that's just not the case. On one hand, the employer knows a strike is deeply affected by a strike. And two, the strikers usually are part of a union or strike fund and so forth. And so the fundamental premises on which this is being pushed are not accurate. But this is something they're pushing. There's one more instance where we're just loading up burden after burden on our job creators, on our employers in the state. And at a certain point, right, the proverbial frog in the pot, right, actually boils, right? We're about there, and we're getting there. And, you've heard from us today, tonight, as we talk about a lot of ideas, it's easy to get a little bit depressed about the future of the state. I often say we're getting California, Illinois-style policies in our state, but we're not politically, that's not where we're at. We're a narrowly divided state. 52 to now, 48 Republican. And so we're a narrowly divided state, but we're getting policies as though we're, a 64 to 70-30 policy. And so for anybody, tempted to come away tonight as we talk about lots and lots of bad legislation and things like that, one thing that I always try to leave people with is that there is hope for our state. It is really important that we stay unified. John wrote a great article after the 2022 election about how we need to stay unified, and that's why people here are doing what we're doing, because Minnesota can be saved. There's 5.5 million people here who deserve better than what they currently have. Politically, we can get political change, and then we can get some better policies in the cookie stuff we're talking about today.
Well, Jim, let me add to that too, because politically it's a very, very narrow split. But, we poll every quarter with our magazine, Thinking Minnesota, as part of the demographic background. The questions we ask each time, do you consider yourself to be liberal, moderately liberal, middle of the road, moderately conservative, or conservative? And always, there are way more Minnesotans who say they're conservative than liberal. And so, yes, we're getting lousy policies, but it's not because your neighbors are all a bunch of crazy left-wingers. They're not. The raw material is there for us to work with, to succeed in making Minnesota a better place. Now, we have just one more agenda item, so we're going to go back to depressing you a little bit, because you probably have heard rumblings about the idea that the DFL thinks our personal income taxes are not high enough.
Yeah, I won't say too much about this because we'll just jump out the window or something. But we already have, some of the highest personal income taxes in the United States. At least twice now in the last couple of sessions, the proposal has come up to institute a new fifth top tier of state income tax. And obviously that's bonkers, but people, it's one of those ideas that hasn't gone away. It will come back. They're just on their best behavior this year, which is why it's not being pushed. But it's an idea that will come back. And you will see a lot of people say things like, well, they'll just sit here and pay the tax, they won't move anywhere else. The data just doesn't show that. No matter how many sloppy op-eds the Star Tribune run saying that rich people love sitting in Minnesota paying the taxes, the data show that it is just not true. And I could list you a whole bunch of things that people say in Minnesota, oh, this is a fact, out-migration is all just retirees. Well, no, it's not. Retirees who out-migrate, 80% in the last couple of years of our net out-migration has been people of working age, 16 to 64, 80%. And they're not moving, necessarily to the nicest places in the world in terms of the climate. North Dakota, South Dakota, people remember that as well, they're for a shot. I think I just make the point again. I think they can't be stressed enough. These bad ideas will not go away, they will keep coming back.
All right, we're a little bit over, but we've got a few minutes for questions. So raise your hand if you got a question, and we'll take as many as we can. Yeah, over there.
Hi. This last Tuesday, I just voted in the primary for the Hennepin County Commissioner office. And when I voted, I had to certify that I was properly qualified to vote for that. For those people, illegal migrants who are receiving driver's licenses, 16 and 17-year-olds who are receiving driver's license will all receive voter registration. What is it that will prevent them from voting other than just that little statement that they have to certify?
Essentially, nothing other than their general integrity and the prospect of punishment. That's essentially what should be what we have, or what we have to rely upon based on the general policy of race. And the thing about this, the point I make is that, say we trust 100% of the people out there, and that is, we all know that is a foolish assumption, but let's just say that. What we should do is have an election system that people can get intrinsically, that people can have confidence in. Even if it is the case that people are generally upright and things like that, we know fraud happens and things like that, but still, even if we're trusting, we still need to have a system that the ordinary person can look at and say, well, that makes sense, I trust it, and so forth. Obviously, the current system with things like that, like you mentioned there, is absurd, and it's conducive to people not trusting our electoral system.
All right, let's take some more. Yeah.
I got a question. What about, I don't know, it used to be where they'd throw you in jail if you hired an illegal immigrant. And you couldn't do that. now we have so many of them up here and all over the country. Are these people tuned into the system where they're paying Social Security? Or if you want to hire one, do you have to pay them cash? Or just how do you go about hiring a...
There's universal basic income or the basic income pilot project, $100 million, which I don't think has a residency requirement.
None whatsoever.
And there's also a proposal to create basically a shadow unemployment insurance system that is specifically targeted at non-residents. So this all goes to the point that like everything that they're doing is making this a state where it's easy not to work, which is crazy when we're in the middle of a chronic worker shortage. So I know that doesn't directly answer your question, but that's another proposal that is out there to try to attract more illegal immigrants to the state and do what with them, right? I mean, pay them not to work, that's crazy.
Let's do some more, yeah.
I have a question with the nonprofits. Is there more oversight in light of with the scandal with the feeding nonprofit? Last November, I did about 100 hours of research on nonprofits that are receiving money through Hennepin County and realized that there's a pattern. There were about 9 nonprofits. They're not registered with the state of Minnesota, which is a violation of state law. They're not filing their taxes, and some of these nonprofits are having their federal taxes done, revoked, and they're still receiving money.
Question is there increasing oversight of nonprofits following the Feeding Our Future scandals? Anything about it?
As somebody who ran for Attorney General against Keith Ellison, who presided over the Feeding Our Future scandal, I've got lots of thoughts on this. I can speak with you afterwards for a couple hours, but broadly there's not. And our nonprofit system, and this nonprofits received last legislative session $1 billion from the state. There's nonprofits out there that have previously had budgets of a few $100,000 and receive money from the state in the millions. And so we have we've funneled an immense amount of resources into our nonprofits, and we don't have sufficient oversight of them. In the AG's office, they have a few attorneys there who are theoretically tasked with overseeing our nonprofits. There's another couple other state agencies that, in theory, are meant to oversee the money that they give them. But the fact is, it's extraordinarily inadequate, and all we have to look to for that is the Feeding Our Future fraud, the largest COVID fraud in the country. $250 million is actually over that amount. The AG's office sat on its hands for months and failed to deal with that. And there's been essentially no reforms statewide. They've done some things to move around the back chairs on that Titanic, like put an inspector general in the Department of Human Services. But that's superficial stuff meant to quell public frustration about rampant fraud in our government programs, but ultimately no fundamental reforms to deal with it.
Well, and no one's been fired either. It should be a starting point. Let's teach us 2 more. Yeah, lady back there.
Just wondering, how bad does it have to get in Minnesota before every conservative gets off the couch and votes? We lost some races by hundreds of votes this last time, and we wouldn't be in this situation. And, not to diss anybody here, but I'm looking around, and we're above a certain age, most of us. And the second part of my question is, how do we get the younger people involved and voting and interested? I think that's the $1 billion question.
Well, it's a big question, and it would take a kind of a long answer because there's a lot you can say. Now, we have an organization for young people at American Experiment, the Young Leaders Council, and it's the biggest organization of conservative young people in Minnesota. And that's one thing we do to try to stimulate activism among people who are right thinking.
Yeah, one point I'd make, and it goes back to something that John said earlier, is that if you look at, so take this kind of, war on Uber and Lyft in Minneapolis. Now, there's several groups of people that's going to affect. One of whom is kind of disabled people. They want to pay them higher wages, which is going to price them out of work, but that doesn't matter so much if they can't get to work because Uber and Lyft have to stay. The whole thing is awful. But another, I think one of the ride shares, Uber and all that, shared online the top 10 pickup places in Minneapolis. It was all bars and restaurants that were getting 90 or something. Now, so you think, who's hanging out there? Well, it's not people my age, people younger than me. So this attempt to try and, as John says, recreate the labour conditions of the 1950s is not really going to cut it with people who are used to just pulling out their phone and putting on whatever arrives, whether it's a transport or a meal. So really young people do kind of look, I think, in their lives for that kind of decentralization that you get with economic freedom. And they're not looking, for the state to provide a ride-share service. That's one of the proposals, by the way, in Minneapolis, that the state government's going to get into the ride-share business. And can you imagine what that's like? You walk out of a bar at 11 o'clock, you spend an hour on the phone, and eventually somebody tells you that you're going to get picked up from Fridley 3 months from now. It's absolutely ridiculous. But that's what will happen. It will be the Skoda or the Lada of ride-share services.
And by the way, one thing we didn't have time to get to is that as bad as our legislature is, there are other sources of wrongdoing in the state, the city of Minneapolis, the city of St. Paul, Hennepin County, all of these groups too have been contributing to the issues that we have in the state of Minnesota. So the legislature, yes, is public enemy number one, but at the same time, at the local level, the county level, we're seeing a lot of bad policies put into effect that compound the problems that our state has.
One thing I have to bring up is that, this isn't your grandfather's DFL, right? And this is, and you see it play out, especially in places like Minneapolis and St. Paul, where you have majorities on the bodies that are militant or leftist members of the Democratic Socialists of America. These are extraordinarily hard left folks, and this isn't maybe not the most conservative position out there, but my view is that we have to start at the statewide level. We have to start making sure that our cities, our major cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul in particular, start conducting themselves in a manner that doesn't destroy our state. If Minneapolis and St. Paul, continue down the trajectory they are of defunding the police, of hostility to fundamental basic services, things along those lines, what we need to do is, I think, step in legislatively statewide to preempt some of the worst policies they have, or for example, put some strings on some of the spending. They get immense amounts of resources from the state. You should say to Minneapolis, look, either you get an adequate number of police officers on your police force, or you don't get the money that you otherwise would have gotten. Because right now, our state is being so significantly affected by an absolute crazy people on the Minneapolis City Council, the St. Paul City Council, and so forth.
I'll just add, Republicans and conservatives generally need to do a better job of consistently putting the big themes that matter in front of young voters' faces. And you can't just show up in August and try to explain why the Democrats did all these terrible things and now this is going to affect your life. Because, my attempt, 39 years old, my brain's been damaged by social media, the phone. The people you have over me, it's even worse. So attention spans are short, and you have to consistently drive that message, which is why I admire so much the work that the Center does, the work that Jim's doing. I love the work that FID does, but we need our party units to do a better job of more consistently driving those big themes out, especially to young millennial and Gen Z voters.
Well, we're a few minutes after 7 o'clock. We're going to have to officially end the program here. Thank you all very much for coming on. Let's have a round of applause for our panel.